All right, I'm still Claude Barfield, a resident scholar here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to our event this morning, Trading Up, which we will deal with both the politics and the substance of the Trade Promotion Authority, Potential Trade Promotion Authority, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Our format this morning will be, we are pleased and honored for the first time, I think, here at the headquarters, as it were, to have Congressman Boustany from Louisiana, who will open with remarks, and then we'll have a little discussion back and forth here at the table, and then turn it over to questions from the audience, and then go on to our excellent panel, and then complete. They will talk, and then we'll complete again with questions and answers from the questions from the audience. Sometimes they're answers too, I guess. As I said, it's my pleasure to welcome Congressman Boustany for the first time here at AA, though I think we've done some work with him up on the Hill itself. Congressman Boustany, as many of you know, represents the 3rd District of Louisiana. He is also a member of the House Ways and Means Committee and chairman of the House Ways and Means Oversight Committee. He is specialized in tax and trade issues, among other issues, and is very much a part of the mix in terms of the maneuvers to get the TPA through and to get a TPA that the administration can support and the Congress can support. If inside U.S. trade is correct, and often they are, he's also very much in the mix of this change that's going to happen after the election. So they may be looking for a new head of the Subcommittee on Trade for the Ways and Means Committee, and we'll just have to see what happens. It's my pleasure to introduce Congressman Boustany.
Well, Claude, thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here at AEI this morning. I want to thank you for this opportunity. Why is this important? Why is trade important for the United States? I think that's a key question we have to answer today, and we need to keep answering that question to put this at the forefront of what the American people are thinking and believing as we go forward. Well, let me just point out, first off, that trade is vital for economic growth in this country. And if you look at what's happened coming out of the recession, 2 things kept us from falling back. One was exports, and the other was our new energy renaissance, which has really revitalized manufacturing in this country and also opened up new opportunities for further exports in the energy sector. But if you look at what happened in the first quarter of this year, we now know that the economy contracted for a variety of reasons. And one of the things that I'm really concerned about is the fact that we have seen a rise in protectionist measures around the world, reported by a number of different entities. And we're also seeing various statistics in trade showing that exports are down. Economically, this is critical for the United States if we're going to grow the economy. We know that 1 in 5 jobs is related to trade. In my home state, 400,000 jobs are related to trade. Louisiana is a maritime state, centrally located on the Gulf of Mexico with the Mississippi River. Trade is vital. We have a number of ports, including the Port of New Orleans, which are engaged in this. And whether you're talking about energy and the refining industry, where we're now seeing exports of refined product for the first time in many, many decades, the prospect for LNG exports, which the epicenter of all of that is in my congressional district in South Louisiana, and also the potential for crude oil exports. All these things are changing the landscape of the international economy, and this is an opportunity for the United States to lead. So that's the economics of this in a very concise nutshell, and we can get into it more, but why is this important on a broader note, geopolitically? Well, first of all, historically, it plays into the strength of the United States. Coming out of the World War II, post-1945 era, we recognize as a country that trade and opening up international commerce was vital for national security, period. And the genesis of the Marshall Plan and the development of that plan and the implementation was all related to the fact that we needed trading partners. We needed to help build trade capacity so that we would see this American century dominated by international commerce, free flows of services and goods, and it was successful. But here we are today, coming out of this large recession. We look over to the east, and we see in the east China Sea, South China Sea, ratcheting tensions among key trading partners and major economies. We are seeing problems, as I said earlier, with a sluggish economy, a fragile economy. The world's emerging economies, whether you can go from Brazil to Turkey, Russia now, but with separate sets of problems, South Africa and others, are seeing serious strains in their economy with sluggish growth. We're seeing problems across the globe with these countries having problems with their gross external financing requirements. Some could potentially default. Turkey, a whole serious set of security problems, internal problems on top of the economic issues. Europe, great deal of unrest, very sluggish economy. These are problems, and cumulatively, I worry about the impact on global security. Trade is the opportunity for the United States to lead. And I think the president rightfully put forth an aggressive attempt, or at least discussion of aggressive attempts to move forward on the Trans-Pacific Partnership and on TTIP, and to a lesser extent some other items like the Trade and Services Agreement and other trade arrangements. But the fact is, if we don't engage economically, we're going to falter, and we will not show the type of American engagement that is necessary. I had dinner with a number of ambassadors over the last year or so, but one episode just struck me, and I've talked about this on several occasions. I was with the Turkish ambassadors, a very small dinner, and we were talking about the situation in Turkey. And at one point he stopped and he looked to me and said, "Charles, take your finger and draw a circle on the table." And I did that. He said, "You and I know that's an imperfect circle. You need a compass with a reference point to draw a perfect circle." He said, "The United States is that reference point. And if you don't draw the perfect circle or attempt to do so, others will start drawing circles, and you will not like that world." Here was the Turkish ambassador crying out for U.S. leadership. I was in China in March. I've heard similar discussion, from some saying we need a U.S. partner. Our other Asian partners, the Japanese obviously, and others, are looking for the United States to take a lead. Trade is the way we do this. And key to this is Trade Promotion Authority. January 9th, Chairman Camp, Chairman Baucus, after a year and a half of hard work, came up with the Trade Priorities Act of 2014, and it's languished. Mike Froman and his team have done a good job in trying to move forward on this, as well as conducting negotiations. But the fact of the matter is, we have not seen the full engagement of the administration. That's not a partisan statement, that's a fact. We have not seen the engagement of all the elements in the administration to prioritize getting Trade Promotion Authority done, because without Trade Promotion Authority, we will not get a high-level Trans-Pacific Partnership or TTIP agreement. And it's important now because our allies, our negotiating partners, are questioning American resolve. This is why we have to do it. Congress has to do it, and we need to do this in a bipartisan fashion because it sends a stronger statement to our partners around the world. We could pass it in the House with a largely partisan vote. Senate prospects are more concerning. But this is where the president needs to put his intellectual capital and his implementation of moving forward on Trade Promotion Authority in place, and look at what's happened in the past and as to how we can do this. Because if we don't, we will not get a high-level agreement. And I'm afraid that these negotiations will falter, or we could slip back and get something that's more watered down. If we don't get a strong TPP agreement, it's going to make TTIP difficult. And also the flip side of the coin is the same. We know these negotiations are tough. And the European negotiations, I believe, have now been made more difficult and more complex given the outcome of the European parliamentary elections, where we've seen significant gains by far-right and far-left parties who are anti-European and or more skeptical of American leadership and skeptical of trade. That's why all of this is so critically important. Let me just close out, because we can get into the weeds on a lot of this in the Q&A, but let me close by saying the president yesterday gave a speech, on Wednesday at West Point, on his views of national security, a defense of his national security and foreign policy approach. But trade was missing in that speech. And our engagement through international economics, trade, these trade agreements is vital and is linked to our national security. That is a lesson we learned from the 30s. It's a lesson we learned post World War II, and it plays to our strength. That's why we need to do it, and we need to engage everybody, whether it's the think tank community, the business community, small businesses. We'll all have a stake in this, that if we do not get trade promotion authority, and we keep delaying this, the clock is ticking, and it's going to weaken our position. And so I'm asking everybody, I'm urging everybody to join me and get engaged in this issue. While so many people are focused on the elections and other domestic policy issues, this has to be a top priority for the United States. Otherwise, I do believe we're going to see a number of imperfect circles around the world, as the Turkish ambassador described. And this will be very problematic going forward for U.S. security and for economic prosperity for the United States and our trading partners. Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and happy to take many questions.
I think I got this on now. Thank you very much, Congressman. I'm going to take you from first, at any rate, a couple of questions I will ask, from the high policy toward trade to low politics. We know that the Democrats are divided on trade, and particularly in the House of Representatives. But my question relates to the Republicans in the House. And I would just relate that over the last couple of months, again and again, it's come up as to, we focus on the Democratic divisions, but what about Republican divisions? And a week or so ago, a former member of the Obama administration, who's certainly not particularly partisan, and is very much pro-trade, said, we're really worried that there are a number of Republicans, Tea Party Republicans, and then Republicans who just don't like the president will react against this and not want to give Mr. Obama a victory whenever TPA comes up, or TPP. Now, Tea Party Republicans voted overwhelmingly for the 3 FTAs that came up 3 years ago. What, from your perspective, what is the situation in relation to the number of, I'm not trying to say the exact numbers, but how much support do you really think the Speaker and Chairman Camp and you and others who are pushing this can find from your own caucus? Is there a split?
Well, there is a potential split, and there have been outside groups trying to foment the split, exacerbate it, and we've pushed back very heavily. We've done a number of very informal whipping operations, and what came out of this on the Republican side is that, first off, we had a huge educational process we needed to embark on. We have so many new members right now that they don't understand that trade promotion authority is basically Congress exerting its authority in trade policy. They thought maybe this was just relinquishing our authority to the executive branch and violating our constitutional prerogative. We had to first get through that barrier, and I feel pretty comfortable now that we've overcome that hurdle with our members based on my conversations with many of them. But keep in mind, when last time Trade Promotion Authority passed, it barely passed, maybe I think it was 2 votes, and we only have 53 or so members who were in Congress at that time. That gives you sort of a metric to understand the magnitude of the problem that we had on the education side. We had to demonstrate that TPA is a way Congress exerts its authority through negotiating objectives. It's a way that we set up a consultative process by law with the executive branch. And in fact, the Trade Priorities Act of 2014 takes this even further in that it allows any member of Congress to be a part of that consultative process with USTR, to demand briefings and get them, to have access to the negotiating text and full briefings on the negotiating text and its status. It empowers Congress, and it allows us to exert our constitutional prerogatives. I think we've overcome that part of it. Now, there's still outside groups that are pushing and fomenting trouble with this, and that's why we have to keep the pressure on. And the same thing's going on the left, obviously. And there are some Democrats who are with us. The Speaker said in the House, in order to move forward, we want at least 50 Democrats. It's a pretty high mark to hit historically, that's been a problem, and we want somebody in leadership. And so we're keeping that pressure on because we want pressure on the administration to get on the Hill. Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Treasury, State Department, they need to get there on the Hill and make the case. And they need to give cover for Democrats. We'll provide the cover and the necessary information for Republicans, but Democrats need cover on this if we're going to get it done. And the president has a lot of work to do in the Senate. And I've had conversations with people in the administration, aside from Mike Froman, and they still have not gotten the full import of that message. And that's where we need some help.
My second question is a little broader, and that is, I realize that this is speculative, but how do you see this all playing out? Are we really, is it just going to stagnate until the election and then you go for TPA? How will this go? Suppose the administration did, let's take the best possible case, what would be the situation if they, say, concluded negotiation of TPP late summer or fall? I'm trying to get some how these things are juxtaposed.
One of the things we're hearing from the administration is that they think they can get to an agreement without TPA, and I vehemently disagree with that. I think we need a very strong statement coming out of Congress to get a really solid agreement. Watching what's happened, when the president, for instance, was in Japan, there were talks between the president and Prime Minister Abe. There was this talk about flexibility in the tariffs. And this gives me some concern without knowing the full detail of what was happening in those discussions. I get worried that we're going to see a step back from a robust, high-level agreement that's truly going to knock down these barriers. I have heard repeatedly from members of Parliament, both from Europe, from Japan, as well as the ambassadors from the respective countries, that TPA is really necessary to give them the impetus to move forward on hard domestic reforms in those respective countries so that we get this agreement. So I'm really concerned, and I'm determined, I think along with Chairman Camp and others on the Ways and Means Committee, to keep this push alive and keep driving this administration to move forward on TPA, recognizing, yes, we want our negotiating partners to stay at the table and not walk away. But at the same time, we've got to get this done.
Okay, we're now open for questions from the audience, and I'm not excluding my colleagues here on the panel. The Congressman has a few minutes, so I'm going to just go right here. Please identify yourself.
Yes, thank you. Hi, my name is Ben Hancock. I'm with Inside U.S. Trade. Thank you, Congressman, for your comments.
Right up there in the front row, you see.
I just wanted to follow up and ask you a little bit more about, you said you felt like you had gotten over that first hurdle with your own party, your own caucus, and doing some more outreach efforts. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that informal whip count that you did and a little more detail of what you found and the pressure that you're continuing to apply and the threats that you see from outside a little bit. I don't know if you want to name any particular groups, but I was interested to hear you say that. Secondly, I wanted to make sure I understood you clearly about your understanding of what the administration is saying regarding TPA. I think you said that they feel they can get to an agreement without TPA. I don't think you mean that they're saying they can pass an agreement without TPA, but I want to make sure I'm getting that.
Right, yeah. I think what I'm hearing is that they think they can conclude negotiations and get it to a point where they could take it, they're prepared to come before Congress, and then they would ask for TPA. We don't think that's the right approach. We think TPA is essential to give our negotiating partners assurance that we're negotiating in good faith and that we will push to get the strongest possible agreement, knocking down tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers. I'm concerned that this thing could drift and the agreement, the administration could opt for an agreement for the sake of getting an agreement rather than to get a strong agreement, which is what we really want. With regard to the whip process, the first round of this, it was conducted by the House Ways and Means Republicans in conjunction with a broader group that's just been interested in trade. It's a trade working group. And the first efforts were basically, do you have a position on trade promotion authority and what it means? And then we provided educational background. And secondly, do you have any other specific issues that cause you concern? I think the initial response was good, especially after we provided some background information. And I say initial response. We went by and, we went through and checked everybody. Then we went back and checked them after we provided information. I feel pretty good about where we are with that. Next step will be digging down further into what are your specific concerns district-wide that you might have, whether it's textiles or, you can go down the list of issues. And then secondly, in addition to that, we really need to see the specificity of what we're talking about. And now that we have a bill, it's been a lot easier. We've asked members to review the Trade Promotion Authority Act of 2014 and get back to us if they have any concerns. And one point I'd make on this, Senator Wyden came in sort of midstream and took over the Senate Finance Committee chairmanship, and he's sent out a number of equivocal signals. I think the more he looks at the Trade Priorities Act of 2014, the more he realizes many of his concerns have already been answered. This is a very good piece of legislation, and we feel that this is the right approach, and we're going to hopefully keep the pressure on Senator Wyden to agree that this bill is a much improved version of Trade Promotion Authority.
Okay, I think there was someone over here. No, come in the back later. Go ahead.
The front table here.
Hi, I'm Mary Berger with Washington Trade Daily. You mentioned feeling some disappointment that the president didn't use the opportunity of his speech at West Point this week to bring up trade, which in the past has been connected to diplomacy and foreign policy, the whole economic statecraft idea. Why do you think he chose not to take that opportunity? Do you think he's waiting until after the election to really put some political capital into trade? Thanks.
Well, I think that the upcoming election is clearly coloring the administration approach, and that's unfortunate because I think external events, some of them of which I outlined, are very concerning to me, and we need to seize the opportunity now and keep the pressure on. So I do think the upcoming elections are a factor in this, and I think there's a sensitivity to concerns expressed by Senator Reid and others, other Democrats in the Senate, and also some in the House. This is where presidential leadership is required, period. The president himself, early on, made these key pieces to his foreign policy agenda, and yet we're not seeing the follow-through. And this sort of follows a pattern I've seen with the administration where you get a grand pronouncement, a speech, a couple of speeches, and then where's the actual follow-through? And just from experience and conversations with other members, the administration has really not engaged the Hill, not only on this issue, but on a number of other issues to the extent they really haven't developed the relationships on the Hill that are necessary to move forward on these issues. But I do think the election is a big factor. But this president is in his last term. He's got to be thinking about his legacy. He made a big deal out of the pivot to Asia. And TPP is a key piece to our foreign policy in Asia. It's not the final answer to it, but it's a key piece to it, and it's a starting point. And with everything going on right now in Asia, whether it's South China Sea, East China Sea, our dealings with the Chinese, this is important. I mentioned my trip in March to China, and what I found was that there's a divergence of opinion about TPP in China right now. You have some of the national security hawks that still see this as containment, which we have emphasized that it's not. It's a high-level agreement that's open to China when they're ready and have taken the steps. But we think TPP is a very important piece to empower the economic reformers in China. And so it has broad foreign policy and national security implications down the line. I'm fearful that with the tensions that we're seeing in the Asia-Pacific region, these are only going to ratchet up without stronger engagement. And that's why concluding TPP, getting a strong Trade Promotion Authority bill passed, which we have, is vital to all of that. It's got to all be contextualized, and I think there's a failure to put the pieces together.
Okay, I think in the back.
Hi, Congressman. Thanks for speaking, and thanks so much for taking our questions. My question is, there's been talks about Mexico dropping out of the TPP due to two anti-dumping campaigns, sugar and steel. And I was wondering, since you're very pro-trade, in general, is there anything that you would, like to make a difference about with, is there anything that should be done about these kind of actions which are harmful for free trade and economic development?
I'm sorry, what was that last point?
Sorry, apologize.
I think if I understand it, tell me if I'm wrong, that you're asking the question, the United States has some sensitivities in sugar. And you said steel, but whatever, anti-dumping, I assume you mean.
Steel and sugar.
Is the United States looking inward about changing and liberalizing some of its own protectionist policies as a part of these? I think that's the
Okay.
question.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think with regard to steel, we're seeing a manufacturing renaissance in the country as a result of what's happening with the shale gas revolution. The low cost of inputs is creating this tremendous opportunity for manufacturing across the board, whether it's refined product, the steel industry, plastics, and so forth. We need to embrace this energy revolution, this renaissance, because it's going to pay dividends on multiple levels for us, and I think steel will benefit immensely from it, and we could see a resurgence in competitiveness. I don't think this is a time to take on protectionist policy with regard to the steel industry. We can compete and we can win. With regard to sugar, it's a complex issue, and my concern is that the major sugar producers around the world these countries heavily subsidize their industry. And the last thing I want to do is just disarm a small industry in the United States that will not be able to compete on a level playing field. And the current agreements we have don't involve Brazil. They don't involve India and other major sugar-producing countries. I think this is best addressed once we get those countries at the table. I think one of the things we've recently asked for is a review of unfair practices with regard to sugar and subsidization. We need to look at this, but I think the pressure needs to be on a broader arrangement with regard to sugar for the United States before we unilaterally disarm on that. I'm for breaking down and knocking down various subsidies across the board where we can do this. But I do think until we have the major sugar producers at the table in trade arrangements, then it becomes unfair. It remains unfair.
Okay, well, I've got two more. Congressman only has a few minutes, so let me take both questions here first, and then here, and then.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Congressman. My name is Shinichi Sobe with CSIS. I have a question about the mood in Congress. Is there any room in Congress to allow now Japan to exclude specific products, agricultural products from the negotiation, or not completely eliminating tariff?
Well, I'll tell you, we don't want to see exclusions. But this is right at the heart of the ongoing negotiations. It's at the heart of the domestic reforms that Prime Minister Abe has boldly embarked upon with Abenomics and the three arrows. But this is the substance of negotiations between the United States and Japan, among other things. But agriculture is a big one. There will be some realism injected into this over time, I think, with ideas about phase-outs, but to run in the other direction and just basically create all kinds of exclusions, I think is the wrong thing to do. I'll cite rice, for instance. Very high tariff structure for rice. We know this is a sacred territory in Japan, but it's going to need to be addressed, and we need to come to a negotiated agreement with regard to rice and some of these other agricultural commodities to truly make this a 21st century agreement. And so, again, that's the substance of the negotiation, and we need to stay at the table and work through this.
Hi, Brett Fortnum from Inside U.S. Trade. You mentioned embracing the energy revolution. Would that mean lifting the crude oil export ban or increasing energy good exports to either Europe or other parts of the world? And if that's the case, what is the chance of Congress embracing lifting such a ban?
Scott right here could attest to the fact that I was probably the first member of Congress to embrace energy exports, crude, natural gas, refined product. It's happened. My district is where most of the many of the LNG export facilities that have already received approval. In fact, the first one, Cheniere, the Sabine Pass facility, is in my district. I work very closely with them going back 5 or 6 years on this issue. Here's why this is important. The United States should not resort to resource nationalism. We need to embrace open markets in energy. And why is that important? We can take a lead now because we can be a major exporter. And we should take the lead. That's consistent with American values. It's consistent with the best form of energy security for the United States. Open markets, diversity of sources. If we don't take the lead in this, then other countries, consuming nations in particular, will be trying to resort to mercantilism, and the producing nations will be involved in resource nationalism and hoarding of these things. I think it's inconsistent for us to berate China about rare earths and their policy on rare earths, and then we not embrace open markets and exports. So for those reasons, I fully support it. We need to look at it. These are going to be contentious issues, but we need to work through the policy of it. But keeping in mind what best suits the United States in the long run will be open energy markets and diversity of sources. The final thing I'd say on this is that we're on the verge of something much bigger than what the United States is doing alone with the energy renaissance. Our integration with the Canadian market, energy market, is a big step. Keystone is vital to that, and I think with Canada building some additional pipelines to find alternative export markets, possibly Europe and certainly Asia, will help improve that energy integration between our two countries. And with the new reforms that President Peña Nieto has undertaken in Mexico, we're watching the legislative implementation of this very closely. If they truly open up the Mexican energy market to outside investment, now we've got a more integrated North American powerhouse for exporting energy. This will put significant pressure on Brazil to change its tune. It shifts the center of gravity in the energy world to North America and to this hemisphere if Brazil comes along. And this is an opportunity, again, for the United States to lead diplomatically in a new era of energy diplomacy that will open things up and improve the situation and reduce tensions around the world. And it'll benefit all the countries, I believe, economically by most efficiently utilizing these resources. If we fail, then we're going to revert back to what we saw in the 70s, and that will be deeply problematic for our country as well as for security around the world. And so this is an opportunity for the United States to lead a new era of energy diplomacy as part of this broader foreign policy initiative, of which international trade is a broad part of this. So we need to embrace this, and we need to be clear-eyed about the policies and understand the geopolitical context, because if we don't do that, we're going to fail and we'll slip back to the same problems we've seen before.
I think on that upbeat note, I'm going to end the session. I want to thank Congressman Boustany for his clear and candid reactions to the questions. And this is your first time here, but I hope you come back to AEI.
I'll be happy to do it.
In the future.
Really appreciate the
Thank you very
invitation.
much.
Thank you.
We'll just start the panel as soon as within the next couple of minutes. I'm going to introduce we have online more extended biographies. I'm just going to introduce our panelists in the order that they will go, just with their titles. We will start with Bill Reinsch, who is the president of the National Foreign Trade Council. We'll then go to Thea Lee, who's the deputy chief of staff at the AFL-CIO and has had a long history in trade policy. She will remember, and I shouldn't say this again because I said it once before, that one of the last times she was here, not the last time, maybe one time before that, I said that she certainly ought to get a huge raise at the AFL because she had succeeded in something that I hated, but she was very effective. I don't know whether she did get the raise or not, but I hope she did. Then we will have Scott Miller, who is a senior advisor and holds the William M. Scholl Chair of International Business at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And last but not least, my colleague Derek Scissors, who deals with trade policy here and specializes in Asia and China. Let's get started. Bill?
Thank you, Claude. It's a pleasure to be here. Looking at my colleagues on both sides of me, I do sort of feel like I'm the warm-up act for the main bout, and I'm going to try to set the stage, and then they can fight it out, and I may weigh in from time to time, but there's a lot to discuss. What I'm going to talk about is a little bit on timing, where the Congressman and I are not quite in the same place, and then talk about TPA, and I hope, if nothing else, make a convincing case as to why it's important to do it, so that my colleagues here can spend the rest of the time arguing over what should be in it, which is the important question, and not whether or not we should have it at all. So I think whether or not we should have it all is kind of a no-brainer. On timing, I've thought for a long time that TPP drives this train, and drives the TPA train as well as its own train, obviously. These are difficult issues. I think we're in a generation of Congress these days where nobody's read Profiles in Courage. Very few of them want to vote on trade issues if they don't have to. So what I see happening is if TPP is concluded at any point, if that's a message to Congress that they're going to have to vote. There is an agreement. It's going to be presented, and the vote is going to occur, and there's no question, I think, but that the leadership in Congress is going to prefer that that vote take place under fast-track conditions rather than in a legislative free-for-all. So what I see happening is TPP being concluded, that being the catalyst, if you will, for Congress taking up first TPA and then TPP. It's a fair point, there's some logical inconsistencies to this. Why are we passing trade promotion authority telling the president what to do after we finish negotiating the agreement? But that really is an argument that says what the president should have done is proposed TPA in 2009, which is what we suggested. But he hasn't taken my advice for a long time, and he didn't then. But so here we are, and I just think that's the sequence that we'll be following. Best case scenario for the proponents, and notice I didn't say the most realistic scenario, but the best case scenario for the proponents is finish TPP between now and the election. The president is going to be really short of the president is going to be really short of victories this fall, and he could use another one, and this is going to be a victory from his perspective, and it's going to be sold that way when it's done. So I think they're going to work very hard to try to finish it, summer, early fall, so they can brag about it. That also puts members of Congress in a kind of a perfect position for them. They won't have voted on it, so they can say whatever they want during the campaign. They can be for it, they can be against it, whatever they think is the right answer, and then they come back and then they can vote on it. And I would expect a vote. If it's done before the election, I'd expect votes after the election. What the opponents are probably going to say, well, there's no time after the election. And all I would say about that is I worked up there for 20 years. There is always time if Congress wants to do something. If they don't want to do it, lack of time is the excuse they use. But the fact is that these are things that can be done if the will is there to do them. And I think if the sequence I'm suggesting begins with TPP, then I think it will follow along in the way that I've suggested. Now, of course, if TPP can't be concluded, and that's probably something my colleagues will talk about, and I'll have a word about that in a minute, different question. Now, as for the substance of TPA itself, I think it's going to get done, and I think one of the reasons it's going to get done that nobody mentioned, I'm a little bit surprised the Congressman didn't mention, is that Trade Promotion Authority is really the way that Congress manifests its role in trade policy. And when I worked up there for members of the Finance Committee in the Senate, I gave all the speeches that other trade LAs gave, Article 1, Section 8, Congress has a role has the role in creating trade policy. Well, fine, I don't think anybody disputes that, but how does Congress manifest that role? They don't negotiate. The executive branch negotiates. The way Congress manifests that role is it tells the president what to do. How does it tell the president what to do? It passes a bill. And it hasn't done that for, 13 years, since 01 or 02. So we have a trade debate wanting in the Congress. We haven't had one for a long time. I think it will be healthy to have one. It'll probably be cathartic, and it'll be extraordinarily painful for the people that have to manage the debate, because there's a pent-up demand of people that have views and want to offer amendments. But that's the way the Congress implements the Constitution. You can't just say, all right, this afternoon we're going to debate trade policy and expect 60 senators to go down to the Senate floor and have a big debate about trade policy. That has no meaning. What has meaning to the president, has meaning in terms of the Constitution, is that the Congress gives the president a set of objectives, says this is what we want you to do. If they don't do that, they're abdicating their responsibility. And as a practical matter, they're giving the president a free hand. And he might like that, actually. But from a congressional point of view, I think eventually they'll figure out that that's not the way the system is supposed to work. And I think they'll get there. Now, it's going to be a difficult battle because there are many people in the Congress that have different views about what that bill should contain. And I hope that what we talk about today, when I get done talking, is what it ought to contain and not whether or not they ought to do it, because it's their responsibility to do it. And I think at the end of the day, they'll step up. Now, on the contents itself, I'll only say a couple things and then I'll stop. The NFTC drafted its own bill, so we have one too. Ours is better, but that's all I'll say about that. I'm not going to do a commercial. If you look at all the bills, they have two parts, objectives and process, and both have turned out to be currently controversial, and I suspect we'll be addressing some of the controversies in the rest of the panel. The objectives is where the Congress tells the president what to do, what I was just talking about. It says, here is what we want you to negotiate. They could, if they want to, say, here is who we want you to negotiate with. They generally confine themselves to generalities. Senator Baucus always said, negotiate with big countries and big economies, don't negotiate with small ones. That's a legitimate thing to say. One can agree with that or not. That is setting a priority. And that's what Congress does, is set priorities. Our bill, and I think what will be Senator Wyden's focus, judging from our conversations with him and what he said, is that we've been focusing on new issues, things that have come up in the trading system largely since the last bill was passed in 2002. Digital trade, free flows of information, intellectual property protection, state-owned enterprises and disciplines on those, sort of global value chain issues, things that people weren't thinking about a decade ago. These are important, one, because they're new issues, and a lot of people care about them. They're rapidly growing in importance in the trading system, and they also, in many respects, reflect where America's competitive advantage lies. We are good at innovation, we are good at invention, we are good at design, we're good at a lot of other things, but we're particularly good at that. And that makes that, I think, in many respects, one of the crown jewels of our economy. And making sure that we defend those interests through trade negotiations ought to be a critical priority. So we've spent a lot of time on it. It's clear from Senator Wyden's comments that he's going to too. That's not to say that the bill the Congressman talked about ignores it. It does not. But I think you're going to see more details. Now, that said, one of the ironies of trade negotiations is that while we all give speeches about the new issues, and it's fun to talk about new issues, my colleagues on my staff spend a lot of time on them, in the end, we spend more of our time on the old stuff. If you just look at the most classic recent example is the EU-Canada free trade agreement, which was hung up over 18 months over what? Beef and cheese. Okay, these are not new issues. I give TPP speeches and talk about SOEs and all the other stuff I just was talking about. What's it going to come down to? Rice, pork, beef, sugar, all of Simonson's friends over there, all of his clients or members, and also Vietnamese T-shirts. We've been arguing about this stuff for 50 years, but the reality is you know, this is part of a trade agreement. And one of the reasons it's part of a trade agreement that makes things complicated is that stuff can all be measured. If we give the Australians something on sugar, and that's not a prediction, but that's a hypothetical, I guarantee you the next day the growers will be before Congress saying this is going to cost us this many thousand jobs and this many $1 million in returns. And what am I going to say? Because what's going to happen is if we do that, what are we going to get from Australia? Better rules on SOEs. That's really important. Who's going to go up to the Congress and say that's going to create how many more jobs? Hard to measure. Skews the debate. But that's just one of the things that we live with. So a lot of the other parts of the debate, it's not going to be just about market access. It'll be about labor, it'll be environment, it'll be things we've been fighting over for 10 years. Americans are really good at fighting the last battle, not so good at fighting the next one, and I think we're going to see that. On the process side, I was going to say something about ISDS, but I think I'll save that for later, which is really what a lot of the objective debate is about. On the process side, this debate has taken the form of a big argument about transparency. This is allegedly, you know, these are secret agreements being negotiated in secret, and nobody knows what's in them. My view is good. I think it's better that they're negotiated that way. Most negotiations are confidential, and they ought to be, because if they're not, what you get is a lot of posturing and a lot of politicking over interim results. I'm not a big fan. Having watched government in the sunshine when I was in the Congress and been there before, and after it evolved to do more things in the open, I'm not a big fan of it. I do make a distinction, however, between public transparency and congressional transparency. Under the Constitution, the Congress has a right to all this information. This administration, I think, has been tighter in giving out the kind of information that the Congress has a right to have than previous administrations. They say not, but I think if you talk to people on the Hill and talk about what they have to go through to get it, and they can get it, but the hurdles, speed bumps, is tighter. And I expect what the Hill is going to do is create a whole bunch of hoops and reporting requirements and things to try to improve transparency and consultation. Frankly, healthy debate. Why not? And I think they're entitled to the information and they should have it. But, and that, frankly, if the whole TPA debate ends up being about that, as opposed to some of the other stuff I've been talking about, we're all going to be better off. I think at the end of the day, what happens, though, is we resolve these issues and it passes, and then we move on and address both TPP and then eventually TTIP, which I haven't gotten into because it's farther down the road. And with that, I'll stop.
Bill, before I turn to Thea, can I ask you one quick question in terms of timing? What have you heard about the potential changes if the Republicans win the Senate? Is it likely that they will want to just move over to the next Congress on TPA, for instance?
Good
There's been
point.
discussion about that. You're closer up there than I am.
Yeah, good question. Well, most of you know, well, maybe you don't. Most of you know my politics. I don't think they're going to win the Senate. And I certainly hope they're not going to win the Senate. That would be bad on many levels from my point of view. But, well, many other levels. Let's put it that way. But I think you're right. What normally happens if there's a change of control in an election, lame duck sessions end up being useless because the incoming majority refuses to agree to anything because they assume that they'll be able to do better when they get in. By the way, that often turns out to be an incorrect assumption and a mistake, but it is made every single time, and it will probably be made this time. So you're right about that. I should have mentioned it.
Thank you, Claude, and thanks to Bill Reinscher. I'm delighted to be here this morning. I'd like to thank AEI and Claude for inviting me, and also, I haven't forgotten that Claude once said I deserved a raise, and I can't say I got a raise right at that time because I thought it was maybe a little bit crass and self-serving to print out his piece and put it on my boss's desk, but I appreciated it nonetheless. That's right. I don't want to contribute more to... It might well have been. But I think it's important. It's nice to be here because I think it's interesting for me to bring the labor viewpoint to this discussion as I have for more than 20 years. As Claude said, it's been a long time. It's maybe impolite to say exactly how long. But I am a critic of current U.S. trade policy, And I'm a critic precisely because I actually agree with Representative Boustany, precisely because trade is so important to our future as a nation and to the current economic challenges we face. But I also believe that we are on the wrong track, and I know we can do better. And that's why I am so engaged in the trade debate. Not because I hate trade, contrary to popular belief, but because I believe trade is important, and I believe we need to rethink the underpinnings of our trade policy, and I haven't seen that. And so in some senses, the debate today about fast track and TPP is a little bit premature in the sense that it isn't just a cold, hard question, should we pass fast track, should the Congress do this? But it's hard for me to answer that question when I see our country being on the wrong track, and I don't think that the current fast track that's being debated or the current TPP that's being debated is where we need to go. So I would say we need a strategic pause, a deep breath, or in parenting terms, and my daughter's now 19, so it's a little bit outdated, but a timeout where we could all stop, go to our corners, and think for a little bit about what are the first principles that we're trying to achieve with our trade policy. Because I think too often our negotiators are really on autopilot. They're negotiating the kind of agreements they've always negotiated because that's what they know how to do, but not necessarily because they are achieving our national economic goals or whether they've even taken a close look at what the outcome has been of past trade agreements. Did they perform as we had hoped, expected, and predicted? It's almost like it's the old story about the drunk looking for his wallet under the street lamp, and somebody comes along and says, where did you lose the wallet? He said, well, I lost it over there. So, well, why are you looking here? He said, because the light is better. And I think we can look as long as we want for our wallet under the street light because it's convenient for us to do that, but that's not really going to get us, we're not going to find the wallet there. So the goal, in my view, shouldn't be that we get more trade deals faster. It shouldn't even be simply to get tariffs down, because I think everybody on this panel would agree that trade agreements today are much more ambitious than simple tariff reductions. And if they were, I think it was Ann Kruger, famous free trade economist, said many years ago, a real free trade agreement is one paragraph long. Tariffs between country X and country Y will go to zero tomorrow. That's a trade agreement. The kinds of things that we do that are 1,000 pages long that are deeply enmeshed in the domestic regulatory fabric of all of our trading partners and us, and more important, in our domestic macroeconomic context and goals. We have a very weak labor market today. Next month will be, I think, the 5-year anniversary of the end of the recession. The end of the recession. The recession's been over for 5 years, and yet we continue to have, first of all, grotesque inequality. Claude made a reference to that, but all the economic gains over the last couple of decades in this country have gone essentially to the top 10%. That means not just the median worker and the median family losing grounds, but the bottom 90% of American workers and families are losing ground. That is an economy which is on a very fundamental level not delivering for its constituents. And the trade deficit at about 3% of GDP, a little over $500 billion, is a drag on the economy. That's not an opinion. That is an accounting identity, a C plus I plus G plus X minus M. When you have a net chronic trade deficit, you are undermining your economy month after month after month, year after year after year, and undermining your labor market. Now, you can say the trade agreements will help, and that's what we've certainly heard over the years. If we just do more trade agreements, we'll have more trade. But we haven't seen overall the pattern that signing more free trade agreements has reduced the overall current account deficit. It hasn't worked that way. And certainly there is a lot of evidence that trade and capital flows, and that's really what the other part of trade agreements is, have exacerbated inequality. Not the only cause, maybe not even the largest cause, but certainly a contributor to the growing inequality that we've experienced. And I think that's something that we ignore at our peril. So it comes back down to basic principles, and I want to get to the specifics, but that if our basic goal is not just to lower trade barriers, but to protect capital as it moves overseas. And if you read the trade agreements, the investment chapter, the intellectual property rights chapter, the financial services, a lot of what we do in trade agreements is about foreign investment, not about trade. And for that reason, we have to come to terms with the impact if we are really using our trade agreements to incentivize, reward, and make more profitable outsourcing of good jobs in some cases, then that does go a ways to explaining why trade in its current form has been so unpopular. So the fast-track debate is inextricably intertwined with the question, do we want more trade agreements modeled largely on the existing ones? And I'd say there is not a resounding yes. If there were a resounding yes, then we wouldn't be having this discussion right now. Fast track would have passed in 2009 if it were easy and if it were popular. And we do have a horse-cart problem, I think, as everybody has said today. If trade deals are deeply unpopular, then Congress is reluctant to grant negotiating authority to the president. Bill talked about having a vote after the election in the lame duck or early next year. And that's, in my 20 years in Washington, this is something that is a received principle, which is that trade votes take place in odd years generally or in lame duck sessions. And you talk about profiles and courage. If it's so great, why does it have to be separated from an election so that both Democrats and Republicans in the constituencies forget what that vote was by the time they next have to elect their representative and senator? But if the trade deal is completed and it's popular, then fast track really isn't necessary. It's a sort of an afterthought. And I would disagree. I know the Congressman was talking about how important it is to have fast track in place and so on, or our trading partners won't take us seriously. I think by this time, this is just rhetoric that happens. People just say it because they've always said it and because they want it. I actually agree with Bill that in an ideal world, Congress would have an orderly way of expressing what its priorities and interests are to the executive branch, and that could be done earlier. But in order for that to happen, we need to rethink the content of our trade agreements. And let me get down to that. And what would a different or a better or an improved grant of trade authority look like? And we've had a lot of conversations about this within the labor movement, with some of our allies in Congress and in the NGO world. And so I would say there's three categories that we're looking at: transparency, accountability, and content. And on transparency, I disagree with Bill. I don't think it's necessary for trade negotiations to happen in secret in order to be successful. And I think actually the transparency has been a distraction, because in fact, almost everybody knows what's in the trade agreements. Everybody knows what the US government has put on the table, because it's essentially Korea or Peru. It's the last trade agreement is essentially what our government puts on the table. There's a big secret around that. It's a phony secret. We may as well just reveal it and have a national debate about what we want our government to do. It should not be a secret, and it's been a distraction. It continues to be a distraction in the European context as well. In terms of accountability, I think Congress wants and needs an expanded role at various stages, both determining whether the goals that were set have been met, not just, and I've been through a lot of fast-track battles, as many of you have as well, but the idea of laying out a bunch of negotiating objectives and then telling the executive branch, go do your best. And if they meet some and they ignore some, that's the way it goes. You still have the up or down vote. If Congress really wants more control and more accountability, then I think that would be better. And particularly in selecting the partners and screening the partners for trade agreements. I think that's a very important part of the process that the executive branch tends to have very little oversight on at the moment. The content part is most difficult, because if we had national consensus on what should be in trade agreements, this would all be a lot easier. But I think that it's important, and we need to connect trade promotion authority, trade negotiating authority to broader competitiveness concerns, including currency, enforcement of current trade laws, infrastructure, and the tax structure, because those are all things that are part of the domestic economy but are really intertwined with how we engage in the global economy and how successful we're going to be. Let me just say a few words about TPP and then hand it over to my fellow panelists, who I'm looking forward to hearing from. And TPP, in our view, is, from what we've seen, and of course, I am a cleared advisor. I do have access to some of the negotiating text, so I have to be careful not to say anything in this context that is part of that. But I think there's been so much in the press already that that should not be much of a problem. But TPP and TTIP together cover enormous ground, as everybody's aware, maybe 2/3 of global GDP. So this is pretty important. The two negotiations, the two mega treaties that are happening today are hugely important in that sense. But I'd say another sense that also is important with TPP, which is that it is structured as a dock-on agreement. And I know Congressman Boustany said, this is a high-level agreement open to China. And if the concept of the TPP is that once it's negotiated, any country that walks through the front door could say, I agree to the terms that are on the table, I want to be a part of it. Congress in principle would have to make a decision to vote on that, but it hasn't been entirely clear to us, even as cleared negotiators, cleared advisors, exactly what that process of dock-on would look like. But what that means is essentially we're not just negotiating an agreement with 12 countries, we're negotiating with every country that's not already in a trade agreement, or some that are already, like Korea, that are already in trade agreements that might want to do that. And that means that this is more weighty than past deals. Especially with respect to the labor and environment chapters, as Claude knows, one of the ways that we have operated is to try to use each successive negotiation to improve and strengthen the labor and environment provisions in trade agreements, and to close loopholes, to figure out what's working and what isn't working. If TPP is the last agreement we negotiate, then this is the ultimate labor and environment chapter. In that sense, it has to be better. It has to really meet a very high standard, because we're not going to be able to fix it along the way later as we go. But so economically, there are a lot of issues with respect to TPP. Bill talked about some of the ag issues. Those are of less concern to us, but certainly with respect to Japan, autos, market access with autos, and whether simply negotiating a deal, I think everybody would agree that negotiating a deal that simply reduces tariffs sequentially between the United States and Japan, with whom we have an enormously lopsided trade relationship already, is not necessarily going to achieve the U.S. market access that we hope for. And we certainly have bad experience with that in past deals, particularly with respect to Korea. Vietnam and Malaysia also significant industrial exporters, so there's a lot of job concerns for us with respect to those. In terms of the template or the content of the trade agreements, I think the investment chapter is extremely important, both in TPP and in TTIP. Bill glossed over it, the investor-state dispute settlement. I think this is a vulnerability for the TPP and the TTIP. I know there's been discussion that the Cato Institute, from a very different perspective, has put out a briefing paper recently saying that the U.S. should just drop investor-state dispute settlement from our free trade agreements, that would unleash them, it would take away some of the burden, because there is legitimate criticism of the investment chapter, that this is essentially our government using trade agreements to selectively subsidize outsourcing corporations. That's something we've been saying for a long time. People didn't take it seriously, but I think when you hear it from the Cato Institute, it has a different kind of ring to it. But I think this is emblematic of what's wrong with our free trade agreements, to the extent that a trade agreement is about using the negotiating capital of the United States government to protect companies that move jobs overseas, rather than simply to open markets. It does open itself to legitimate criticism in terms of jobs, and a separate and important and legitimate issue is the issue about democratic decision-making and sovereignty, whether corporations have now been elevated to the level of governments and are suing governments all over the world for environmental, public health, and labor regulations they don't like or that cost them money. In my view, that is the wrong use of U.S. government negotiating capital. Bill talked about global value chains, and I'm wrapping up because I know there's other folks who need to talk. Global value chains or rule of origin in trade agreements is important to us, but we don't necessarily agree that having the weakest possible rule of origin so that companies have the maximum amount of flexibility and can produce goods places and get in third countries and get all the benefits of a trade agreement is not necessarily why we negotiate a trade agreement. We would like to keep the benefits of the trade agreement to the parties at the table who have made the market access reciprocity commitments and have made the other commitments with respect to labor, environment, investment, and so on. Bill talked about innovation, and just quickly, I believe innovation is one of the strengths of the United States, but I also think it's linked to manufacturing and to production, as the argument that Andy Grove, former CEO of Intel, made a while back, that if you move all of your manufacturing to another country, then the engineering and the innovation, oftentimes, maybe not right away, but maybe a couple of years later, will go with it. And I believe we're at a dangerous place there, and that our trade agreements need to recognize the importance of that. So, and finally, I'll list a bunch of things. We can talk about them in the Q&A. Rule of origin, procurement, SOEs, I think is important. Currency is missing from the TPP. A bipartisan group of members of Congress in both the House and the Senate have asked our government to include currency provisions in the TPP, and yet it's not on the table, and we're at the three-quarter mark probably with respect to negotiation. Why not? Why isn't it there? It needs to be there. And the labor and environment chapters, we would like to strengthen and the labor chapter, as we do on a regular basis, close the loopholes, improve the enforcement and oversight, and yet we don't see much possibility that there's going to be significant strengthening of that chapter at this time. So let me end there and look forward to the comments of my fellow panelists and to your questions. Thank you so much, and there we go.
Okay, we'll come back to specifically what you would like, particularly with the letter yesterday from the 150 Democrats on the labor side. But let's go on to Scott.
Sure. Let me make some fairly brief practical comments. I'm a supporter of TPP for mainly practical reasons, and TPA, for practical reasons. I think it helps our negotiators act and think more clearly. It helps them get to bottom lines, helps them understand the political calculus. I also think it's practically important to congressional leaders because of the way it minimizes, does not eliminate, but minimizes congressional freelancing. So I think that it provides real benefits and helps you get where you want to be on your trade policy, at least where the president has outlined he intends to go. I also think that it has a very important political function, and I would hope that the administration would consider doing it in advance of concluding an agreement, because what the Trade Promotion Authority does, despite the discomfort members will feel for it undertaking it, is it helps build the winning coalition for your ultimate trade agreements. I think that's probably its pivotal reason for doing it. It's important to do it now. Look, as Bill pointed out, it's been 12 years since we've done it, and one of the things, I'm by training an engineer, and statics are different than dynamics, and policy tends to be static. But commerce, particularly international commerce, is quite dynamic, and trade costs, to be more specific, are subject to both policy changes, like reducing tariffs in a regional trading arrangement or on an MFN basis. That's a policy change, but also technology has a huge role in changing trade costs. And trade costs have been falling radically since about the mid-1980s, pretty steadily, mostly due to technology changes. At some point, because of the pace of technology change and the way it affects commerce, okay, it's very important to have the policy debate, because policies themselves have a half-life. You can see it in our existing agreement. I would argue that our existing trade agreements have a half-life of utility. NAFTA is a good example. NAFTA is 20 years old. There was, in 1994, when NAFTA entered into force, there was no commercial use of the internet. The internet was a hobby over at DARPA and at a research center in Switzerland. Nobody used it. So there's no e-commerce chapter. There's massive e-commerce that goes on in North America every day, and businesses rely on it, yet the agreement didn't consider it. Also, you can see in NAFTA, the amount of trade subject to preference has been peaked in about 1998 or 1999, and has fallen steadily. Now, some of that is due to tariffs reducing on an MFN basis in North America, but there's a lot of trade in North America that no longer actually, you don't waste time applying for a NAFTA preference, partly because NAFTA was about the way trade was done in maybe 94, but probably 1987, okay, or when the objectives were set. And the world's changed. Technology has changed dramatically, and the issues have changed because of it. So that's the real reason to revisit this. It's hard to revisit because Congress changes too. Mr. Boustany made a key point of the 215 House members that voted for the Trade Act of 2002, which was the vote was in 2001, the first vote in the House. Of those 215, there's 53 still in office in the House. So the changeover in the Congress, the need to consider the views of the current members of Congress who ultimately will form that political coalition to pass the agreement is very important. Now, that leads me to say the contents of TPA would be determined very practically because it's really up to the president to determine how he builds that political coalition. It was built a specific way in 2001, 2002 by the Bush administration, and again, a divided Congress. There was you'll recall, there was a Republican House and a Democratic Senate during that period of time. And so now some of the things in the Trade Act of 2002 held up pretty well. I would note in investment policy, there were some key amendments in the Senate which were defeated, and the policy that came out of the Trade Act of 2002 was basically replicated in the model bilateral investment treaty of both 2004 and the model bit of 2012 from the Obama administration. So some of the policies wind up being fairly durable. Some of them aren't, okay? The 2002, the agreement on labor and environment was basically an enforce your own law standard, and it didn't hold up. It was the May 10th, 2007 agreements were basically a reconsideration of that because the agreement that was in 2001 wasn't durable. Well, the reason it wasn't durable is because life changes, members change, majorities change in that case. So that's all practically part of this. What it really, for me, it comes down to is the core question is how will the president build this political coalition to pass the trade agreements that he's negotiating, and really it comes down to a matter of Congress is a really powerful institution when it can add to 218. The Senate's really powerful when it can add to 60, and it really can't do much of anything unless it can get to those numbers. So that's the key. Now, I would observe, as Bill did, based on the votes and actually as Congressman Boustany did, if you look at the votes in 2011, the natural coalition seems to be pretty heavy majorities of Republicans. The three House bills, which cleared the Congress for Korea, Panama, and Colombia, all had over 200 House Republicans voting in support, and had between 30 and 60 Democrats of caucuses which are of similar size today, similar composition. Senate bills passed a little more easily. I think Korea was 83 to 15 or something like that. And then this has always been easier in the House, in the Senate than in the House. In 2001, 2002, the close vote was in the House. The Senate passed, I think there were 70 votes or so in favor of the Trade Act of 2002 in a Democratic Senate. So, but practically, this comes down to coalition building, and what's a mystery to me, and I look forward to the conversation with the audience, is how the president intends to build this political coalition that underlies the practical need for TPA. Thank you.
I'm not going to say much about TPA. Politics is a serious disease, and all I have is a thermometer. The temperature plummeted when Senator Reid made his, for people who follow trade, infamous comments right after the State of the Union. The patient, which is TPA, hasn't recovered, and the only person who can raise the temperature is the president. So, he's either going to do it or he's not. I want to talk about the substance of TPP, and not to disappoint the audience, I will then take shots at the end. But I'll agree with her in part. Let's start with the rules of origin, which is something that gets overlooked, and I think Thea and Bill have both pointed out that it shouldn't be overlooked, and they're both right. This is what matters crucially to our partners, to people outside of the trade talks, to future trade negotiations. It's the core role of TPP, not just about value chains, but about the open-ended nature, potentially, of TPP that Thea referred to. Obviously, TPP is not the last trade agreement we're going to negotiate, because we're negotiating TTIP right now, and it's going to be right afterwards. But the rules of origin in TPP are going to identify it as whether it is supposed to liberalize or whether it's supposed to create a trade bloc. And to be frank, there are strategic advantages of both approaches, but they are very, very different. And so when people skip over rules of origin because they can't be very technical, and in textiles they're a matter of long political battles over very little value to the U.S. economy, you shouldn't. That's rules of origin tells you a lot about TPP, whether you like them, the outcome, or you don't. I saw an early version of text on rules of origin. I have not seen anything since. I can't say whether I'm going to like TPP's rule of origin. I might hate them, but they're going to be important whether no matter what side you are on for the final result. Currency, this is shot number one at the protectionist side. Currency politically is important. I'm in favor of transparency. I disagree with Bill in that respect. So if members want to talk about currency, they can. Substantively, it's a bad joke. It's a joke. If you just look at actual evidence tying Chinese currency practices, China's of course not in the TPP, to U.S. jobs, there isn't any. I'd be happy to debate that with anyone. I've done it for 20 years. The treatment of Japan, the operationalization of a currency manipulation chapter doesn't include Japan, because Japan can't be accused of currency manipulation on any basis that's been proposed to now. It's because Japan used to be a currency manipulator, and they might be again. This can't be a U.S. trade priority. So politically, we've been talking about it incessantly for no good reason. Members want to talk about it, they can talk about it. So if it's in TPA, I don't really have a problem with it being TPA. It's not going to make any difference to U.S. trade results. And I don't think we should put our efforts into currency negotiations either. Competitive neutrality and state-owned enterprises. I think there'd be fairly broad agreement in the U.S. There are some defensive interests within the U.S. government and certain U.S. corporations which are essentially treated as state-owned enterprises. There are not very many of them. Certainly, we can accept more binding restrictions than pretty much anyone else in the negotiations can. Our problem is going to be with our partners. The Australians have a view of competitive neutrality which I think is absurd. If you're dealing with the U.S. and Australia, you can have that view. When you're dealing with Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, much less the Chinese, and this includes Europe, you can't have that view. So what would be great on competitive neutrality is if we got very strong terms coming out of the U.S. because they're going to be watered down. And I actually think people on the panel, most Americans would agree to very tight restrictions on SOEs. We can talk, I've written about this. We can talk about the details of those restrictions if you'd like. Market access, this has already been touched upon. The big thing, agriculture is a key part of U.S. comparative advantage. We need improvements in agricultural market access. Obviously, those improvements would be bolstered if we'd stop the idiotic restrictions on our side. It just amazes me that American negotiators, the U.S. is by far the biggest agricultural surplus producer in the world. I'm not saying that we're necessarily more efficient sector by sector than the Canadians, the Australians, or maybe the Brazilians, but in terms of aggregate, we're the dominant agricultural producer by far. We dwarf Saudi Arabia in oil, but we let our agricultural negotiating positions be dictated by tiny little sectors. This is just ridiculous. The U.S.-Japan negotiations over agriculture are appropriate bedfellows. IP, people have already said this, and I agree again. If you don't enhance IP protection in U.S. trade deals, you probably shouldn't bother with them. Along with agriculture, IP is the heart of U.S. comparative advantage. The details do matter, and I want to discuss that when I get to some thematic issues, sort of where in IP you're going to emphasize. But a lot of the domestic IP stories are misleading. This is not, the thing I want to drive home about IP is there are domestic arguments in the U.S. and there are international arguments. The domestic arguments are the standard ones about ownership versus competition that are associated with patents. Fine, those are good, tough arguments. Internationally, this is a no-brainer. We're the IP generators. If you're interested in U.S. interest, you protect intellectual property. And so the domestic forces lobbying against strong IP rules are confusing the two situations. Investor state, which is tied up to sovereignty, I think I'm maybe surprisingly more on I've joined the unholy alliance between the AFL-CIO and Cato. I don't really think this is very important on the commercial side. I do think the stories that get told about infringing upon sovereignty are ridiculous, and if you talked about them for 2 minutes, they'd be revealed at ridiculous. But I don't think this should be an important part of TPP. It can be done in bits to the extent it needs to be done. I'm going to also touch on this in the thematic issues, which is what I want to close with. 2 big thematic issues. One is inequality, and one is the role of trade deficits. And on inequality, I actually agree to some extent with the protectionist position, with the thoughtful trade position enunciated by the AFL-CIO and Thea here. I think inequality is a real issue in trade. Free trade clearly hurts the non-working poor by cutting costs of imports. It helps the poor who are working in non-tradables, things that aren't subject to trade competition. But it has a divergent, it has a splitting effect in tradables. When you are subject to competition and you're competitive, you get a lot about more open markets. When you're not, you lose. And that creates inequality. It also can create inequality at the top end by rewarding owners to capital, while the results for labor providers is mixed. So this is a real issue and something I think we should discuss. And I think that's one of the arguments for being strategic about IP protection. There's IP protection that is jobs intensive, and there's IP protection that is not. And maybe we should focus on the IP protection that is jobs intensive. Investor-state relationship. Investor-state protection is going to reward owners of capital. If we're worried about inequality, maybe that shouldn't be a priority. So I think there are real issues to bring through here. They're controversial, but I really think that there are real issues to talk through here, and I'm quite sympathetic to the argument that inequality should be part of the discussion. I'm going to close with the attack on my ideological opponents, or the ideological opponents of free trade. Trade deficits are ridiculous measurements of outcomes. And Thea actually said this exactly correctly, only she didn't take the next step. It's an accounting identity. People who think trade deficits harm the economy take an accounting identity, which we made up in the 1930s, and said the trade deficit reduces GDP. Who cares? Try to spend your GDP per capita. It doesn't mean anything. GDP has a causal relationship with jobs. No, it doesn't. GDP is a made-up accounting identity. It doesn't cause anything. It's like saying 2 + 2 has a causal relationship with 8. So we've got this argument on the left that is obviously wrong-headed. It's been made for so long that people don't recognize it. I shouldn't say the left. Take that back. On the protectionist side, that's obviously wrong-headed. It attributes causality to trade deficits and GDP that don't exist, have never existed, don't make the slightest bit of sense if you think about them. And that's the basis for a lot of their opposition to trade. Oh, well, I don't like the Korea agreement because it boosted trade deficits. Who cares? It doesn't mean anything. If you did a correlation between U.S. trade deficits and job growth, you would get a slight, insignificant, positive result. There is no statistically significant relationship between trade deficits and job losses in the U.S. And the concrete example I'll close with, because this is the one that drives the point home to everyone, is protectionists think that 2009 was a great year for the U.S. economy because the trade deficit fell $300 billion. That must have created a lot of U.S. jobs, or at least saved them. Of course it didn't, because the trade deficit fell because our economy contracted. What happens in the U.S., because we're the reserve currency country, is we run trade deficits when our economy is growing strongly, which means it's creating jobs. So the whole argument that's made criticizing trade agreements for leading to trade deficits or not curbing trade deficits, it's wrong. When you hear that argument, you should be immediately suspicious and asking a lot of questions. I think there are other reasonable arguments about inequality, about transparency, and so on. That one is silly. Stop there.
Well, on the silly note,
I'm the last speaker. I have to be provocative, or everyone
course.
just falls asleep.
Of course. It was not a criticism, it was just a point. I'm going to turn to the audience. So, if there are any quick comments back and forth of what's been said.
There are going to be a lot of quick comments.
Okay, all right. With forbearing, let's go to the audience for questions. Have it stunned you? Did Derek stun you?
I can
with
keep
silence?
going about
Yeah.
how silly all of the positions you guys have been arguing for the last 15 years are. Currency, trade deficits. I can do it.
Here we go. Inside trade has got to earn his keep here.
Derek, you've focused on China a lot in the past, and I wanted to ask a question about a comment that Congressman Boustany made about TPP empowering the economic reformers within China. I wanted to get a sense of whether that's a credible argument. I mean, I think people have made that in the past. There's always this notion coming out of the administration that if we just tell the Chinese that this is in their best interest and they'll be really excited about it. And I just wonder if you put any stock in that. And I think I'll start with that. Thanks.
Not really. There, you know, I think marginally, TPP certainly puts pressure on the Chinese. You saw that when, after Japan joined, they suddenly want to negotiate a bit with the U.S. I mean, those things were directly connected, both causally and chronologically. So fine. But negotiating a bit, restarting negotiations a bit with the U.S. with what seemingly are new positions doesn't mean we actually have a good bit. So this is just a little spur. It's a little tiny prompt. What will cause China to change its behavior is a functioning, successful, dynamic TPP. We don't have one. We don't have any kind of TPP, and we're not going to have one next month. So, you know, when people start talking about China here, and, you know, as you're right, I spend most of my time on the Chinese economy. When people are talking about China here, I want them to be right, because I want to say, oh, great, I'll get to talk about China. But we got 50 hurdles to jump over before we start getting TPP's effect on China. Eventually, you could get an important TPP effect on China. We're nowhere close to that now. We're just getting posturing by the Chinese in response to what is essentially posturing by the TPP countries.
Well, I have a couple of questions. Well, go ahead. Go ahead.
Back and respond to some of Derek's pieces. And, Derek, I do appreciate those few areas where you said you agreed with me, and I'll file that away for future reference. But on two issues that I think are important, currency and trade deficits, let me just come back a little bit. First of all, if negotiating currency provisions in trade agreements is stupid or useless, so is negotiating reductions of tariffs or subsidies. Because essentially, from an economic standpoint, if you spend a lot of time, whether it's at the World Trade Organization or in a bilateral agreement, taking a tariff from 7.5% to 5% to 2% to 0, and you say nothing, and you do nothing about currency manipulation, or, you know, huge currency swings, you essentially are missing a huge piece. And it could be that you're wasting your time negotiating reductions in tariffs and discipline on subsidies. If then a country is allowed to intervene systematically, one-sidedly into the currency market and change the value of their currency. So the fact that Japan does not today qualify as a currency manipulator is irrelevant. When you negotiate a trade agreement, you all in this room know that a trade agreement is forever. Sure, they have exit deals, but nobody wants to use the exit clause of a trade agreement, so you have to assume it's forever. And also, as everybody has said, Korea and China are potential entrants to TPP, and so it's quite relevant and quite important, and I think it's a huge hole in our trade negotiations that we don't know how to talk about currency manipulation, and our international organizations, the World Trade Organization and the IMF, which in principle could have jurisdiction over this, have chosen not to engage, they don't know how to define it and they won't. So we need to do it in the context of our bilateral or regional agreements. With respect to the trade deficit, I know you believe in math, Derek, but there's just a simple fact, which is if we were to close a half a trillion dollar trade deficit, either with more exports, less imports, or some combination of those two things, that would be good for jobs. That would create millions of jobs in the United States. And I understand, you know, that there are other pieces, the investment flows, the capital flows, and so on. And there is a legitimate question about causality and directional causality. And with respect to business cycle and recessions, there are good ways and there are bad ways to get the trade deficit down. Going to a recession is a bad way to get the trade deficit down, and it doesn't create jobs. And I think it's unworthy of you to pretend that people like me who make an argument about chronic trade deficits would be happy in 2009 when the economy's in the tank and the trade deficit falls. That's not what anybody's talking about. But I think it's important to, when we run a chronic trade deficit the way the United States has, and we have closed down a lot of the manufacturing capacity that we have, and our domestic producers and manufacturers are struggling with unfair trade practices and unlevel playing field, whether it is abusive labor and environment conditions in other countries, or manipulated currency, or subsidies, or other unfair trade barriers, then I think it's just not intellectually honest to say that the trade deficit itself is irrelevant. Thanks.
We could spend a whole session on this. I've given Derek 1 minute.
Okay.
Because I want to move on
All right.
before we finish to a couple of other things.
The answer on currency manipulation is, first of all, defining it is a little bit difficult. But second, there's just no evidence that it has a bearing on the U.S. economy. So when we're talking about negotiating something in TPP, we're not talking about the grand stage of the WTO. We're talking about the actual impact on the U.S. And if you go through case by case, notwithstanding all the political fuss, you can't find any measurable impact. So that's my point there. The point on trade deficits, I mean, Thea just made my point for me perfectly. She said, and I think there's something to this, it's a little bit unfair to say 2009 should have been a great year. But she said, and also using her words, if you close it by exports, you close it by imports. Those are massively different ways to close a trade deficit. If you have $500 billion more of U.S. exports somehow, hopefully by making the U.S. more competitive, that is job creating. You cut the deficit by cutting imports $500 billion, you're doing exactly what happened in 2009. You're boosting costs to consumers, you're taking away inputs that are absolutely needed for the functioning U.S. economy, and you're crippling jobs. And normally what happens, because boosting American competitiveness is hard, is that the protectionist side falls back on import restrictions and forced balanced trade. And that's where acting as if the trade deficit hurts you automatically is ridiculous, because the solutions hurt you much more. So I partly retract my 2009 comment, but Thea did exactly what I'm talking about. She switched from there's a trade deficit to acting as if the ways that trade deficit are composed don't matter, when in fact, of course, they're absolutely critical.
Okay, we're moving on. I have 2 questions for Scott and Bill. One, to go back to something Derek said. He talked, and I agree fully, substantively, on changing rules of origin. But from what we've seen, what's been leaked, and where we are, I think there's no chance in hell there's going to be a big change in the rules of origin, and that what the United States is negotiating is exceptions with individual countries. My second question is sort of in terms of where we are today. I saw just this morning there's discussion on the Hill and maybe among some of the interest groups, and I think on the ag people, about, well, if Japan can't live up to its ag responsibilities, let's just go on without them and kick them out. Give me your reaction to both of those points. One or the other, or both of you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
On rules of origin, look, this is an area that if you follow the work of the OECD, the WTO, and others who are investigating value added in global value chains, which is a better representation than straight import and export data of the way the world actually works today. You would come to a very different idea about how to use rules of origin. So and for me, one of the disappointments of our current trade policy is that we didn't have a debate about where real U.S. interest lies and how the U.S. adds value, and look for ways to structure our negotiations around that. So I think that the negotiators are doing exactly what you or I would do in the situation they're in. They have no new authority, okay? They're operating as if it's 2002, okay? Thea made this point earlier. I think she's exactly right. Without a really serious policy debate, what you fall back on is what you did the last time. And I think that's why TPP looks like chorus. Okay, it looks like chorus because that's the thing we did the last time. Negotiators are hardworking and skillful, but they're trying to play the hand they've been dealt on the rules of origin. The Congress and the administration have failed to take into account the way the world has changed. So I think it's a disappointment. I think it's particularly bad that we're relying on the rules of origin in textiles and apparel that may have been suitable in 1974, but have no real effect, and in fact are harmful to U.S. interests in 2014. So, but that's where we are, and practically the absence of a trade debate in Congress has contributed to the fact that we're here. On Japan, I'll be interested to hear Bill's comments, but look, the biggest risk that is faced by the administration is for a TPP deal to be signed and have it be really mediocre. As I think the business community and the pro-trade community, the opponents will still oppose. The pro-trade community will take a look at it and say, meh. Okay, and go work on other things. And this is why I would come back that the real reason for TPA, the real reason for engaging the Congress is to build your political constituency. You need a winning coalition to pass these agreements. You're counting on satisfying a group of pro-trade commercial interests. If they are not satisfied, they're likely to work on other things. That's a political risk that is not been calculated properly in my view. Bill.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I kind of have a lot of sympathy for the pork and beef guys on this. I've been giving speeches on this since last fall and suggested that, the Japanese came in the expectation that they would adhere to the principles of the thing, which is zero tariffs. And if they're not going to do that, that's not only a huge disappointment. I think the appropriate response for the United States is to say, well, if you're not ready to do what everybody else is prepared to do, then we'll move on without you. And when you are ready, you're welcome back. I think one reason for that is exactly the one that Scott said. From a perspective here, we need to have an agreement in which there are demonstrable, identifiable, measurable U.S. winners who will go up to the Hill and say, we win. Otherwise, the proponents aren't going to be spending a lot of time working for this. I think the other reason is that for my companies, which are primarily not in agriculture, a lot of this is about rules and creating standards and rules for the trading system that we hope will be exported to other TPP entrants down the road, read Korea and China ultimately, because I think eventually they'll come in if the thing gets off the ground, which is what we were talking about a few minutes ago. And the same goes for TTIP. It's about creating a trading system in which which is pursuing basically a Western-based rule of law, high standard system that we want to invite other countries to live up to. My members would rather have a high bar with 11 countries than a low bar with 12. And that puts it about as simply as you can. If we can't get a high bar on all this stuff, including market access, we would rather have Japan out, get the high bar, because that's the bar that's going to be set for the other countries that will be coming in, bring the Japanese in later, because they will come in later. It's just going to take them longer.
Bill, can I ask you a quick follow-up? I mean, and this is for everybody. So I don't have an answer because all I have is my thermometer. Do you think that there's growing sentiment on the Hill to drop Japan for the moment? Or is it, because the ag producers said this before, is that tide rising or is it stable?
That's a good question, and I don't really know the answer. Scott?
My sense is it's not measurable in trend basis. It comes up episodically. There are concerns about Japan. Look, Japan is the big market access opportunity in TPP for American firms. All right, it's a big economy. We have an MFN trade relationship with. It's unlike the other reasonably good-sized economies in TPP where we already have a free trade agreement. So there's real market access opportunity. It's attractive from that standpoint. The reticence to conclude is partly due to the fact that Japan joined late. Okay, and so I think there's been a lot of pressure on Japan just because they were late to join the agreement and they probably had the furthest to go. But I wouldn't sense any trend one way or the other. There is, I would characterize it as concern bordering on suspicion about how much Japan really intends to liberalize and the commitments they're really prepared to make.
One other thing, just one comment on that. I don't dissent actually totally, but I think with Japan in now and the fact that all the other things we've talked about beyond agriculture, and I understand the need for, that's a key political constituency that you have to have. But the worry has to be a little bit that among the other Asian nations in TPP, that if actually Japan did go out, the whole thing would begin to unravel. And that's not a totally impossible situation.
No, these things fall apart. Look, if you remember the free trade agreement of the Americas, that one unraveled when really due to Brazil's.
Some of this also is kind of late. This is the kind of thing you get with negotiations. We'll just raise it. Not to say that you wouldn't carry through with it and let them go out, but there's a lot of sort of maneuvering here. I'd like, with indulgence, one more. Okay, well, all right, I'll go to the question, and then we have one more thing up here. Quickly.
Thank you for the interesting discussion. You know, with regard to Japan and TPP, I thought Japan joined TPP and we looked the other way on their expansionary monetary policy. Now, their policies have essentially failed, I think. And is that the reason why we're now saying, you know, Japan can leave? Or, you know, is there some other reason? I have a question regards to deficit. We talked about trade deficits, but you know, the trade deficits really occur because there's a difference in comparative advantages. That is, you know, cost of production in other countries are much lower than the cost of production in the United States. And if the cost of production in the other countries is lower than greater than the amount of tariff that we impose, then obviously we're going to import more than export. The trade agreement, I think, should focus on where does that comparative advantage come from? Is it coming from subsidies to these companies? Is it coming from some other things? And whatever that is, you know, for example, are they not paying for the design and the IP? Therefore, their costs are lower than things that are manufactured in the United States. Those are the types of things that we should look for and correct, so that both the U.S. firms and the other countries' firms can compete effectively. This issue of comparative advantage, I think people have not really looked at it in that regard, and I don't know if you have any comments about that.
We're going to do on trade deficits and the reason. I have one more specific question, though, and with Thea here. I mentioned that yesterday you have a letter from 150 Democrats. And if I understand this, they really want labor action programs put in place before you agree to have Malaysia, Brunei, and other Asian countries, Vietnam. And that leads me to the question of, and I'll come back to the rest of the people too as to what the reaction would be. Where does the May 10th agreement stand in terms of the AFL and the TPP? And what about, how does this tie to the labor action plans? And to the others, how would this affect, how is this going to affect one way or the other the negotiations or the politics of this? And please be brief because we're really out of time.
I think, as I understood it, the letter from the members of Congress yesterday was talking about some serious labor rights issues in some of the TPP partners. Brunei has serious gender discrimination issues and labor rights. Vietnam does not really have freedom of association. They don't have the ability for workers to join an independent democratic union of their own choosing. These are serious issues. The May 10th language, which talks about adherence to the International Labor Organization core rights and enforcement of own laws and not reducing, is not great for countries that have huge deficits that are way far outside, whose own laws don't even come close to meeting the international standards. So I think that's the basic point, is that there's a huge amount that needs to be done. Where do we stand? I think I said before that we supported the May 10th deal as an interim step, but we want to keep strengthening it. We use these agreements all the time, and we see some of the weaknesses. So we'd like to strengthen the enforcement and close some of the loopholes, and hopefully get an improved labor chapter.
And that would be referenced directly to the conventions as opposed to the declaration.
That's one piece, but I think it's broader than that. It's really about the coverage and about what the enforcement mechanisms are, because I think it's very slow. We filed a case against Guatemala under CAFTA 6 years ago, and it hasn't really come to fruition yet. That's ridiculous, and I don't think that the business community would tolerate that kind of slow reaction for something that was important to them.
Well, it's an interesting letter. The Inside U.S. Trade article that I read noted that all but 13 of the signatories of that letter had written a letter 6 months ago opposing TPP entirely. And that brings me to the point of how you build your political coalition. All right, if the president chose to build a coalition with 175 Democrats and 100 Republicans, or 50 Republicans, that's one way to get to 218. I haven't seen anybody trying to build that. What got to 218 and over in 2011 was a very different array of members, and I think that'll lead you to different policies.
I would say that if you're going to upgrade standards on labor and the environment from the May agreement, I don't think that's a problem by itself. I think if you sell this as a high standard agreement with high standards across the board, you can build the coalition that Scott's talking about. I think if what you do is you say we need to have higher labor and environmental standards, but we need to have 19th century rules on textiles, that's when you're going to have the problem. I think there is a winning coalition in Congress, whether you agree with it or not, on high standards across the board that are going to be difficult for some of these partners to meet, but also open up market access. Vietnam improves, which it needs to do, its labor practices greatly, but it also gets to sell textiles to the U.S. without ridiculous conditions. If you go to the high labor standards without market access, you're going to lose the pro-trade side. If you do it the other way, you're going to lose some middle-of-the-road trade people. So I think a high standard agreement works. It's when you deviate from that for special interests that you get in trouble in the Congress.
Well, I want the audience just to remember that the last word here was that there's a winning coalition in Congress for this. So please join me in a very clear and candid exchange among our panel.